of our in the last 2 weeks, what we did was to talk about the concept of God as it developed in philosophical circles. Then last week, we talked about the concept of God as it was found in scripture. We talked about some of the misconceptions about God. Today, we want to move on to the theological significance of atheism as our third presentation in this series of lectures. Normally, when you hear the word atheism, people in much of the theological circles tend to see atheism in a very negative light. And normally we dismiss atheism as being against God. And because we see it as being against God, we tend to think that it has no value or adds no value to the discussion about God. But such thinking is very far from the truth. This is a rather simplistic definition, and it covers a variety of forms of atheism which seem to reject the central element of theistic belief and some forms of that belief. It is important to understand that, contrary to much of popular thinking, there is some significance to atheistic beliefs. Essentially, much of what we call modern atheism has its roots in the period of the Enlightenment. And the emergence of this phenomenon has served to purify, and it has served to refine a lot of our theological assertions. In other words, atheism has helped Christianity to look at its concept of God, and it has helped Christianity to seek to redefine this God that we claim to have faith in. In essence, it has forced Christianity to look at the image of God that it holds. Therefore, I want to suggest that atheism is a good tool to help us in our reflection about God and to help us to avoid idolatry when we begin to talk about God. Therefore, one can say that the positive achievement of atheism is the purification which Christianity, together with its theology, has undergone. And we only need to examine some of what is called atheistic thinking to realize that much of what was called atheists in the past has in some ways forced Christianity and its theology to tighten up on what it has to say in relation to God, and to be very circumspect in what it says about religion. This evening, I want to introduce you to two so-called atheists, more than any others, because their attacks on Christianity in particular and religion in general have made Christianity very aware that some of its claims are not as clear as they ought to be, and the difficulties attendant to these claims. The two that I will introduce you to are they're normally called humanists, atheistic humanists. because they opted for humanity at the expense of God. In other words, they place human beings first, and they claim that God must die in order for humanity to live. And what will emerge in this atheistic philosophy that I'm going to introduce you to is the belief that God did not create human beings, but that human beings created God, and therefore God is the product of human desire, and God is the product of the human imagination. The first person I want to talk about is the German philosopher, Ludwig, L-U-D-W-I-G, Ludwig Andreas, A-N-D-R-E-A-S, Feuerbach, F-E-U-E-R-B-A-C-H. Ludwig Andreas Feuerbach, L-U-D-W-I-G, A-N-D-R-E-A-S, Feuerbach, F-E-U-E-R-B-A-C-H. His dates are 1804 to 1872. Like I said, he was a German philosopher, and what he tried to do was to account for religious illusion in a psychological manner. As he puts it, he wanted to find in anthropology the secret of theology. He wanted to find in anthropology the secret of theology. For him, therefore, theology was simply anthropology. His intention, as he puts it, was to change the friends of God into being the friends of human beings. He wanted, as he said, to make believers thinkers. He wanted to make believers think, and he wanted to make worshipers workers and candidates for another world into students of this world. He wanted to make worshipers workers and candidates for another world into students of this world. And in fact, he wanted to make Christians into whole persons. I think it is important right at the outset to note that Feuerbach in his early years was a fervent believer. He believed, he acknowledged God as his first and foremost thought. He actually began to study theology in Heidelberg with the intention of being ordained as a Protestant minister. But during his studies, he was transferred to Berlin, and he took up the study of the philosophy of Hegel. And he soon became convinced that the existence of God could not be rationally demonstrated. And he went on from there to deny the existence of God altogether. What he set out to prove to believers was that this God that they claimed to worship was just an illusion, that this God that they claimed to worship was a projection of qualities that we as human beings find in ourselves. The book that made the greatest impact was a book that he wrote. It was called The Essence of Christianity. And he wrote that book in 1841. And this book serves as nourishment for modern atheisms. And it is for this reason that Feuerbach is called the father of modern atheism. What does he say in this book? He says that God was only a myth in which the aspirations of the human consciousness were expressed. God was only a myth in which the aspirations of the human consciousness were expressed. Therefore, those who have no desires have no gods, because for him, gods are humanity's wishes in a corporeal form. Hence, the heart of his contention is that humanity has been alienated because humanity has been dispossessed of something that essentially belongs to humanity's self for the benefit of an elusive reality. Wisdom, will, justice, love, these are finite qualities which constitute us as human beings. What humanity has done with these virtues, this wisdom, this will, this justice and love, he is saying what humanity has done with these virtues is that we have projected these virtues beyond ourselves and objectify them in some fantastic form, which is the byproduct of humanity's imagination. And of course, humanity gives the name God to that fantastic form or entity that we have produced by projecting our virtues onto this being. In this way, he says humanity is essentially defrauding itself. In effect, the world is being stripped of what is its content, and it is being transferred to this being called God. Put another way, he's saying that humanity impoverishes itself in order to enrich this entity that humanity calls God. And he is convinced that that kind of alienation must end, and humanity has to take back the nature which humanity has given away. So the mission of philosophy, as he saw it, was to restore humankind to some sobriety through a sincere and satisfactory critique of religion. So if you ask Feuerbach to define God, Feuerbach would define God as the sum of the attributes which make up the greatness of humanity. And for him, the Christian God carries this to perfection. The Christian God, as Feuerbach sees and understands this God, is a mirror of humanity. He is the object. In effect, the object and teaching of Christianity are seen as being merely human. What is necessary, therefore, is the restoration of humanity to its rightful place. And this will happen, according to him, when human beings are brought to the realization that their one and only God is they themselves. So for him, the question of the existence or non-existence of God is really not a question of existence, is really a question of the existence or non-existence of human beings. For him, there is no God, in the sense that for him, God is the sum of the attributes which make up the greatness of humanity. We need to stop and analyze what he is saying. Feuerbach starts from a very concrete position of humanity in the here and now. And he is saying that this God and this absolute are projections of human qualities, are projections of human characteristics into an illusory world. Therefore, the statements that humanity makes about God are dreams of an individual who is projecting his own being into an abstract idea. Human beings are therefore their own gods. Notice, he's not saying that God is nothing at all. What he is saying is that God is not what the web of theological allusions makes him out to be. God is indeed a mystery, but God is a mystery which is not alien to humanity because it has to do with human nature itself. And therefore, God is human qualities imagined as infinite and personified in a concept. He is saying that when we claim to have faith in God, we are impoverishing ourselves because the sum total of God's existence is made up of the qualities so far as a person can think, desire, love, that person is God. The capacity to reason, the ability to use the mind, these are all God-like qualities. Love makes human beings God, and God as a human being. And therefore, God's love for humanity, which is so much at the heart of Christianity, is humanity's love for humanity self. Let us not dismiss him out of hand, because his analysis of Christianity is striking. Because as he seeks to show us, the essence of Christianity is the essence of human feeling and the essence of human affectivity. He says when humanity looks at itself, when humanity becomes aware of itself as a whole, humanity finds itself confronted by the doctrine of the Trinity. What does he mean? He said, God the Father is I. God the Son is thou. The I is understanding thou. The I is understanding thou. Thou is the love. The third person in the Trinity expresses the love of the two divine persons towards each other. It's the unity of the Son and the Father. And he accuses Christianity of seeing what is not there. He talks about the Christian idea of the resurrection as a satisfaction for humanity's desire to obtain direct here and now certainty of some personal existence after death. So Feuerbach's basic premise is that God does not exist objectively, that religion is therefore an illusion, and he uses that starting point to show that all Christian principles, all Christian dogmas are subjective. The sources of religion, as he sees them, are the intellect and the emotions. So what happens is that humanity, rather than keeping what rightfully belongs to humanity, surrenders and offers its perfected qualities to an idealized, illusory being who is the object of humanity's fantasies, who is the object of humanity's projections. Religion, as defined by Feuerbach, is an attempt to escape from the sadness of life by going into an imaginary paradise. Faced with the harsh realities of life, humanity cherishes the desire for a better life after death. By now, you should be thinking, at least I hope you're thinking, well, how does this all affect me? What does this Feuerbachian thinking say to me? Well, Feuerbach's thinking, what Feuerbach's thinking does is that it rejects God and it places humanity in God's place. And as I said earlier, theology becomes subordinated to anthropology. What he is doing, in his estimation, is restoring to humanity all that was best in humanity, all that was stripped away from humanity and accumulated to form the idea of God. And therefore, for him, humanity is its own God. Now, Feuerbachian atheism only makes sense if one uses the death of God to bring into being a life that is more humane. What we can say about him is that he offers a very acute critique of religion in general and Christianity in particular. And he, in the process, he divinizes humanity. He is saying that humanity must grow up to the point where the realization comes that the illusion is there, otherwise humanity will not survive. We talk about our God as immanent and transcendent. For Feuerbach, immanence and transcendence and the finite and the infinite are effective sets of terms. Essentially, he banishes the historical element in Christianity and proceeds to Christicize or reinterpret the meaning of Christianity. I want to suggest that we think carefully about what Feuerbach is saying and never merely see him as a destructive critic who seeks to eliminate transcendence, who seeks to eliminate theology. I think he wants to make the conclusions of his criticism the premises of a new philosophy. He's attempting reinterpretation. And he's convinced that he can find the true and deeper meaning and purpose of traditional statements about God. He thought that he could understand humanity and its varied interrelations with nature and society as a phenomenon of the world of his day. In essence, his philosophy was anthropological and it was this worldly. We need to think about what he's saying, because some of what he's saying has some value. But the major weakness of what he is saying is that his first premise of the non-existence of God avoids the question as to the possibility of God's existence. In other words, he uses humanity as a key to explain all religious phenomena. For him, the basic law is that humanity must love. I think we have to admit that Feuerbach was right when he said that humanity projects itself onto God when it tries to think of God. We do tend to think of God in an idealized form. But even if he is right there, that really does not mean that that is all there is to God. It does not mean that God does not exist in God's self. Therefore, because we project ourselves onto God, that does not mean that God does not exist. If you were to ask Feuerbach if he was an atheist, he would reject the idea that he's an atheist. For him, an atheist is an idolater. An atheist is an idolater who mistakenly regards himself or herself as a true believer. An atheist is therefore a person who has no faith in the divinity of qualities, a person who feels the need to attach them to some imaginary subject, which he takes as the object of his worship. Therefore, for him, the true atheist is not the man who denies God, For him, the true atheist is not the person who denies God. For him, the true atheist is the person for whom the attributes of divinity, such as love, wisdom, and justice, are nothing. At the base of this particular understanding of God, or this concept of God, this atheistic concept of God, is the perception that there was revelation to humankind in order to give faith to humankind. That was his sole aim. But in order to facilitate that, he felt that it was necessary to overthrow the God of the Christian conscience. Jürgen Moltmann, M-O-L-T-M-A-N-N, in his assessment of Feuerbach, concludes that if God is, as Feuerbach says, a human being, and the human being is really God, then there's no longer any need for transcendence, because there's no longer any qualitative difference between God and humanity. And Moltmann is persuaded that Feuerbach did not really reduce theology to anthropology, as was his intent, but that what Feuerbach did was that he identified theology and anthropology, meaning that what the two were talking about is the same thing. Therefore, his criticism of religion leaves one with the worship of humanity and the deification of the life of the human being. Therefore, for him, for Moltmann, Feuerbach's criticism of religion is religious and not irreligious, because he serves to establish the religion of this world and elevates politics into a new religion. I'm really curious as to how persons would respond to this kind of Feuerbachian thinking, because to me, it seems as though Feuerbach has leveled a serious critique of what we call Christianity. And I'd be curious to hear people's response as to what that means for them. The other person I want to introduce you to this evening is Friedrich Nietzsche, F-R-E-I-D-R-I-C-H, Friedrich, F-R-E-I-D-R-I-C-H, Nietzsche, N-I-E-T-Z-S-C-H-E, N-I-E-T-Z-S-C-H-E. His dates were 1844 to 1900. Friedrich Nietzsche was one of the major exponents of modern atheism. Again, he was a German philosopher. He had an aversion to Christianity. And for all faith in God from very early on in his life. His atheism was an instinctive feeling. It was not the consequence of something else. It was for him a matter of instinct. Nietzsche accepts the fact that the only place that God can live is in the human mind. The only place that God can live is in the human mind. And therefore, the way to get rid of God is not to dismiss proofs of God's existence, but to show just how such an idea came into being and how that idea succeeded in establishing itself in the human mind. The only place God can live and exist is in the human mind. In order to get rid of God, you don't dismiss the proofs of God's existence, but you try to show how that idea of God came into being and how it succeeded in establishing itself in the human mind. For him, this was the only way to finally root out the idea of God. Therefore, he saw God as that to which humanity looked to make good its shortcomings, that to which humanity looked to supply an explanation when humanity feels the need for one. That to which humanity looks to make good its shortcomings, that to which humanity looks to supply an explanation when humanity feels the need for one. And therefore, he prophetically proclaimed that God was dead and that we as human beings had killed God. God was dead, and we as human beings had killed this God. The death of God was for him a necessary preliminary for the liberation of humanity. But this idea of the death of God was only half of what Nietzsche wanted to say. The other half was the creation of what he called the Overman, O-V-E-R-M-A-N, the Overman, who was to take the place of God. The void created by the death of God was to be filled by this Overman. What Nietzsche is advocating then is that human beings must now usurp the qualities of God. This Overman would usurp the qualities of God. Now, Nietzsche believed in the existence of two kinds of human beings. You had the powerful and the weak. And for him, only the powerful had the right to existence, because for him, life is a struggle. And in the midst of that struggle for power, the weak will die off. And therefore, a real, authentic human being is characterized by that human being's struggle to attain power rather than to attain happiness. Happiness for him was static. Happiness for him was simple-minded. Happiness led to decadence. For him to live, one must risk, one must make an effort, one must encounter danger in order to be fully human. And such a life would, of course, entail suffering, it will entail abandonment, it will entail scorn, but it would also entail confident trust. And what emerged at the end of all of this is what he calls the authentic human being. Hence, championing the cause of the weak must now become a thing of the past. The virtues of the Oberman must now stand in contrast to Christian virtues. Therefore, one must do away with Christianity and Christianity's God who defend the weak and the petty. For him, there is no notion of human equality. That was invented by what he calls the weak pygmies. And I like this one. He says that idea of human equality was created by the weak pygmies, the fishermen from Galilee, who were chilled by the grandeur of the Roman Empire. The disciples are the ones who created that idea of human equality. The idea of faith in divine providence, he says, robs persons of their motivation to fight for a better future because they give up their thirst for power and they become passive. In other words, he's saying that all the virtues of Christianity are a radical negation of what ought to be an authentic human life. So for Nietzsche, if the Overman is to live, then there must be the death of the Christian God who demands and guarantees those virtues of weakness and humility and all those things that Christianity likes to talk so much about. We need to ask ourselves, well, what does Nietzsche mean by the death of God? Is Nietzsche seeking to free persons from a false superstition? Or is Nietzsche protesting against a spiritual dryness? Is he pointing to the fact that God has withdrawn from the world? If you listen carefully to what he is saying, you would realize that Nietzsche's notion of God has to do with ethics. It's an ethical notion of God that he is talking about. And what he's seeking to do is to work a reform and to eliminate the Judeo-Christian ideal of humility and charity and submissiveness, and to exalt all human powers to their highest levels. And what is dead in Nietzsche's thinking is the Christian God of traditional ethics. In effect, Nietzsche is opposed to a Christian ethic which has a will to nothingness, more than he is opposed to God. He is saying that one must reject a Christian morality which is against truly living and which debases humanity and which deprives humanity of its power and its love. And you will notice that Nietzsche's sharpest criticisms are against the meek, the pure in heart, the lowly, and the poor. In effect, he's saying that humanity must abhor any ideal which preaches virtues which are directly opposed to the will of power. What he is rejecting is the God grounded in Christian principles. He's saying that if humanity aspires to greatness, then humanity must reject the Christian God, because the Christian God demands submission. The Christian God demands debasement. He says, and I quote, "I call Christianity the one great curse, the one great innermost corruption, the one great instinct or revenge, for which no means is poisonous, stealthy, subterranean, small enough. I call it the one immortal blemish of humankind. I call Christianity the one great curse, the one great innermost corruption, the one great instinct of revenge, for which no means is poisonous, stealthy and subterranean, small enough. I call it the one immortal blemish of humankind." I trust that by now you realize that Nietzsche's atheism is essentially anti-Christian rather than atheism in the strict sense of the word. His philosophy is one that rejects weakness, it rejects simple-mindedness, it rejects pettiness. And this anti-Christian stance is a choice based on personal preferences rather than on arguments. In other words, the death of God is not something that he sets out to prove. It's a choice to be made. Therefore, for him to proclaim the death of God is to free oneself from weakness and pettiness. God's death is occasioned by humanity turning humanity's back on God and saying no to the virtues and principles that God demands. At the heart of this kind of atheistic thought is a yearning to liberate humanity from a whole series of principles that Nietzsche regards as inhuman. And you realize that he would have been attracted to a God who willed human greatness, a God who rejected passivity, a God who rejected inaction. Maybe what we have here is an attack on the distortion of Christianity. It is the denunciation of Jesus as a man of humility and suffering, as a preacher of an ideal that entails the rejection of this world. What he's attacking is a morality and a God who commands human beings to be concerned mainly with heaven. To him, being a Christian meant being weak. Being a Christian meant fleeing from battle. Being a Christian meant hiding in the face of danger. Being a Christian meant despising this world and thinking only about happiness in heaven. And I want you to think about some of the Christianity, some of the preaching you hear Sunday by Sunday, and then to think of it in relation to what Nietzsche is saying. We preach humility, we preach this notion of going to heaven, and this thing about not worrying about this world, but thinking about the world to come. And we need to begin to ask ourselves whether Nietzsche's critique of Christianity has some value to it. Was Nietzsche an atheist? I am not too sure. One can say that he was anti-Christian, and brutally so. One can say that he was anti-weak. One can say that he was a defender of humankind. One can say that he wanted humanity to be strong and great and to measure up to the vision that he had of human nature. I remember Nietzsche was operating in an age when Christianity was being used as a force to alienate persons and to domesticate persons. Therefore, it's not surprising that Nietzsche would rebel against such Christianity. It's perhaps understandable that he would go to the other extreme. His so-called atheism was really a restless and increasingly poignant search for God. He could not accept a God to whom the downtrodden and the defeated masses prayed. I've introduced you to these two philosophers and their different schools of thought, I would like to call it. They are humanistic philosophers because they are placing value on humanity. Both of these philosophers are saying that the rejection of God is the absolute condition of all happiness, and they are asserting faith in human beings. What they are all rebelling against, and quite rightly so, is the caricature of God that they present. You know, and I know, that over time, Christianity has been guilty of producing the kinds of images against which these two are protesting. Their criticisms are justified if one accepts that the Christianity which they're describing did in effect exist, and in some instances it still exists. What humanistic atheism is rejecting is a God who is antagonistic to humanity. It is rejecting all images of a being who prevents human beings from being fully human. And therefore, I'm suggesting that this kind of atheistic thinking can help us to revitalize and purify Christianity. Paul Tillich, Tillich, Paul Tillich, in speaking about the atheist, compares the atheist to the mystic, saying that they both have a mission to liberate humanity from idolatry and to lead humanity to authentic religion. They have a mission to liberate humanity from idolatry and to lead humanity to authentic religion. Humanistic atheism, because of the issues that it raises, has helped to salvage authentic faith, and it is still doing so. What they have done is that they have helped persons to identify the flaws in the way in which Christianity understood and lived out the faith. Only a faith which is not idolatrous can be a fully Christian faith. And neither atheism nor faith is worth anything if it remains just an ideology. I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts at this juncture, because I have given you a lot of food there to think about and for you to reflect on in relation to the faith as it's practiced even now. When you think about Christianity as it's practiced now, and then you think about what both of these philosophers are saying, these humanistic philosophers are saying, how does Christianity, the Christianity we know now, how does Christianity measure up when it faces the critique that we just heard from these philosophers? Is there anybody who feels moved to speak at this time? Anybody? There are a whole set of you out there. Anybody willing to venture to speak? Anybody? Nobody? Hey, nobody's willing to speak tonight to me. I wonder why. Anybody? Nobody's willing to speak. Since nobody's talking to me, I will go on, having talked for nearly an hour. So, atheism has some value. It helps us to clarify our positions in terms of our understanding of Christianity. But there are some modern day manifestations of atheism that we also need to think about. I took you all the way back to the 19th century to hear what those philosophers were saying. But atheism in its modern manifestations is no longer an articulated ideology. The modern day manifestation of atheism has become for many not an ideology to articulate, but it has become a way of life. It's a way that people live. It is a new way of living rather than the conclusion of a reasoned argument. And if you're involved in the life of the church at any level, you'll realize that there are people out there who do not care about God. And they feel no need to justify this attitude. God's existence or God's non-existence is no longer an issue, because whether God exists or whether God does not exist, for some people, changes nothing. God's existence or God's non-existence changes nothing. Faith offers such persons no real help at all. For example, if believers are sick and they want to get well, they must resort to a doctor, even though they claim to have some hope in God. In effect, persons have learned how to live their lives and face up to life's crises and to face up to life's important questions without any reference or any recourse to God. And if we are honest with ourselves, we would be prepared to confess that the essential problem is that people have difficulties in believing in a God who is not constantly intervening in human affairs. In other words, persons are not interested in a God who does not step in clearly and decisively on humanity's side. Therefore, when humanity finds itself in such a situation, when humanity finds itself in a situation and humanity feels its contingency, humanity becomes anxious. When humanity feels its radical finiteness, humanity seeks to allay such fears not in God. A lot of people don't go to God in their times of anxiety, contingency, and radical finiteness. A lot of people allay their fears in the power, prestige, and pleasure, and in some cases by seeking to build a more humane world. What am I saying? I am saying that fewer and fewer people in this modern world now are looking to God for the final definitive purpose to their condition. Fewer and fewer people are looking to God to help them with the unanswered questions of life. Fewer and fewer people are living their faith in God. Many are ashamed to declare their faith in God. You need to tell me if I'm being too pessimistic. Because when I look at what is happening in the world, when I look at what is happening in our societies, God, to me, seems to have lost a lot of ground in the context of our society. That whole debate that went on in Barbados about taking God out of the document that was being produced is an indication that God is no longer at the center of a lot of people's lives. So what do we see as being made manifest in our societies? There is a complete silence in some areas about, and a total lack of interest in everything having to do with God and everything having to do with religion. That's why. Even those people who profess faith are in some ways atheistic. Remember, right at the beginning of this latter half of this discussion, I said that the atheism that I'm talking about here is not an ideology. The atheism I'm talking about here is an attitude of life. People are not hostile to God or hostile to religion. Persons are no longer looking for arguments to refute religion or to refute God. People are simply not interested in God and in religion. As one writer puts it, and I quote, "The majority of us who believe in God take it for granted that God exists. The rest who do not believe take it for granted that God does not exist." Either way, God is taken for granted. Whether a person believes in God or not in our culture makes hardly any difference from a truly religious point of view. In both instances, persons just do not care either about God or the problem of God's existence. And this is from a book called The Sane Society by Erich Fromm. I want to read that again because to me, it is important. The majority of us who believe in God take it for granted that God exists. The rest who do not believe take it for granted that God does not exist. Either way, God is taken for granted. Whether a person believes in God or not in our culture hardly makes any difference from a truly religious point of view. In both instances, persons just do not care either about God or about the problem of God's existence. In effect, persons lack interest in anything having to do with religion, and they have moved from hostility to total indifference. A new brand of atheism has therefore surfaced. It's an atheism under which persons accept only the tangible, material, consumable values. In effect, the belief seems to be like that articulated by John Huxley, which says that advancing scientific knowledge has rendered the idea of God obsolete. That is, the Christian faith has nothing worthwhile to offer persons insofar as their future development is concerned. God has therefore become outmoded, and God will soon disappear. In essence, they're saying that faith in God is something that belongs to the past. Concern about God, even talk about God, is considered to be unscientific. Talk about God is considered to be mythological. Talk about God is considered to be obsolete. And religion is seen as having lost its force and its vitality, and there's therefore no need to attack the idea of God because the world is no longer interested in or influenced by religion at all. No influence is being seen in the moral lives of people. Religion remains part of the social dimension of life, which does not harm anyone. Going to church is like going to another social club. Even though many persevere, people go to church like they go to a social club. I mean, they've been doing it out of habit for all these years, and they wouldn't stop now. And they go through, they persevere with baptisms and marriages and burials according to certain rites. But for many people, these are vestiges of a cultural and social custom. They are no longer religious practices. And even those who claim to believe in God live as though God does not exist. Oh. Of course, there's still some people who continue to profess faith in God. There's some people who would strenuously deny that they are atheistic, but in so many instances, faith is just a word used to cover up our atheistic tendencies. Faith is interpreted simply as something one has to believe, rather than faith being seen as a basic attitude that has to be translated into concrete action in our lives. God is accepted as something or someone who guarantees the atheistic way of life. Religion has lost its critical sense. It is an opiate which reinforces an inhuman world and its mechanism. Even those who claim to believe in God have a picture of God who is an idol, a God who sanctions and safeguards the power and the framework of the culture in which persons live. A God of the power structure, a God who sanctions and expects submission from the dispossessed and the underprivileged, a God who denies humanity and equality in such persons. And there are many out there who feel really secure with such a God on their side. Because such a God asks for very little. You give him a few prayers, a few religious practices, and perhaps a few alms once in a while. And in return, this God is supposed to offer affluence here and an eternity of happiness ever after. Such a faith which uses God as an instrument of dehumanization is, to me, more dangerous than an articulated atheistic position. So how do we respond to this kind of situation? How do we respond to this kind of atheism? Enrique Dussel, D-U-S-S-E-L, Enrique Dussel, in his book, Latin America, Dependence and Liberation, says, faith is possible only if one is atheistic with regard to oneself. Faith is possible only if one is atheistic with regard to oneself. It is interesting that nobody has yet chimed in, aha, my God is still real. And not because I take him for granted that he exists, but because of the role he plays in my everyday life, which reminds me of his presence every day. Rosemary. Okay, but he is real for you in the sense, that what happens in your life, you interpret as God acting in your life. But that is the faith stance talking. So anybody else, having heard what I've said so far, is there any other reaction? Can we have a discussion about this? This whole idea of God. Anybody else willing to chime in? Let me hear some voices. Don't let me talk to myself. Come on, talk up. I know you don't agree with everything I say, so speak up. Anybody? Nobody talking tonight? There are 20-something of you out there. I need to hear some voices. Otherwise, I'm going to feel talking. Aha, somebody coming in.
Just do not know how to react.
Come on, talk to me.
Understand quite clearly the discussion.
Yes.
And for me, it is part of the continuing search, or shall we say God's truth. What is the truth? What is the absolute truth? And I think this kind of discussions helps to spark the thought process.
Mm. But you do agree that a lot of what we do in church, the whole idea of people going to church, that people have been doing it for so long that for a lot of people it has very little meaning. It's something they do. I was having a discussion with a parishioner a couple of weeks ago, not a couple of weeks, because I was here now, I was out of the country for a little while. But this parishioner was saying to me that what happens on a Sunday makes very little difference to the way in which people live from Monday to Saturday.
I would dispute that.
You would?
I would.
What? So you think
well,
that
let me put it this way to you.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in the household of a clergy person.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of what I would have learned maybe might have been as a result of maybe through osmosis.
Mm-hmm.
But that's how it is.
Mm-hmm.
But when I go to church on a Sunday, part of that exercise is to give witness to something which is greater than me.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you really got me thinking, Doc.
But that's the whole idea.
Yeah.
To force people to think about their.
So I don't think that. I don't think that. I would argue that what happens on Sundays stays with me for the whole week, because there's somebody in this thing who knows. A good friend of mine who knows, because we talk about it from time to time, that I mean, if I used to just live, let's say I was a Sunday person only, I wouldn't be talking about God outside of church on Sundays. I wouldn't be trying to get it. We will never, ever, I don't think, understand totally the concept of God. Whether God is a divine spark or an everlasting energy, I certainly don't think that God is what we have portrayed God to be in anthropomorphic terms. I have to agree entirely with that notion. We have made God in our own image. I agree with that entirely.
Mm-hmm.
But I still think that there is something greater than me. Whatever that greatness is, far greater than humanity as a whole.
Okay, but my friend Fireback would say that all that you have done in talking about this being that is greater than you is that you have taken the attributes that rightfully belong to you as a human being, and you have projected them onto a being somewhere out there, as people talk about this being, and you've projected them onto this being out there that you call God, but that's an effect.
That's Fireback's business. Right? That's his business. He can't speak for me.
Oh, he isn't speaking for you, but he's asking you to think about whether or not what you are projecting as your God is in fact an objective reality, or whether what you are projecting as your God is actually your own attributes. Because
that question I am thoroughly unable to answer. I don't think I'll ever be able to answer that question.
Probably only after death, when you suddenly discover that there is no God.
No, I ain't gonna discover that.
Oh dear. That's a person of faith hanging on to their faith regardless. Because the idea of losing the notion of God is something that we as religious people can never fathom. That there is no God. And that all of this is really a projection of ourselves. Thank you for sharing. Anybody else want to share? I'm willing to listen. Anybody else? A hand has come up and it's gone. Anybody else there? Anybody else?
Hello?
Hello. This must be Juanita.
Yes. Good night.
Talk to me. Good night.
When you were talking about the two philosophers, you said, you talked about this focus on humanity. And that one of them said that if humanity aspires to greatness, then humanity must reject the Christian God.
Yes.
Who focuses on certain virtues and principles.
Right.
Mike, I am thinking, why can't you have both? Why must you reject these virtues and principles in order to be great? Why can't you be great with these principles and virtues?
Okay.
Why do you have to reject God if you want to aspire to greatness? Then, so I'm saying you can have both.
Right.
You can be great and you can still do that. And then you said one of them talked, or somebody talked about rejecting a God who's antagonistic to human beings. But if I go back, remember I'm a Christian, so I gotta go back to the teachings of the Bible and Jesus Christ and so on. And all of us were taught John 3:16 from a child. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son and so on. So how could he be an antagonist, be antagonistic towards human beings if our teachings tell us that it is out of his love for human beings and not wanting to see human beings lost or spiritually dead that he gave the life of his son for us. So then I can't, because I'm of the Christian faith, I can't see that as a God that is antagonistic towards human beings.
But the problem I think that we are confronting is that there are some expressions of Christianity that give the impression that greatness is contrary to being Christian. And I come back to the point that I was making all the way through, that I do not think that these two philosophers are essentially atheistic in their thinking. I think for me, they're anti-Christian and they're anti a particular expression of Christianity that existed in their time. And sometimes it still exists in our time, where the understanding of Christianity gives the impression that in order to be a good Christian, you need to be a fool. And so it's all about being meek and mild and humble and all those kinds of things, and let people walk all over you because you are a Christian. And I think that in part, what these philosophers are critiquing is that kind of understanding of Christianity, which was being practiced at that time, and is still being practiced in this modern age, where people still make you feel that in order to be a good Christian, that you need to let people take advantage of you. I remember having this conversation with the former Bishop of Barbados, Bishop Gomez, and he was telling me about, we were talking about scripture and how the scripture says that if somebody hits you on one cheek, you turn the other cheek and let them hit you there again. And if somebody wants your coat, give them your cloak as well. And I said to him, well, after they hit me once and I turn the other cheek, they don't ever tell me what to do after that. Because as far as I'm concerned, if I give you one cheek and you hit me and I turn the other cheek and you hit me, I would think that my next response is to hit you back. But you tell me, no, that is not a good Christian response. So you see, Christianity in some instances gives the impression that you need to be a fool, that you need to let people take advantage of you, that you need to be the humble one, that you need to be the one who is always taking the inferior position. And I think that these philosophers are saying to us that kind of Christianity needs to be critiqued, and that there needs to be the elevation of the human person. And I think that has value to it.
Well, our Jesus Christ,
Yeah,
is described for us as the lamb, and he's also described as the lion.
yep.
So I do not think that my Christianity is saying to me that I must let people walk over me.
It shouldn't.
To me, to have certain virtues doesn't mean that you're going to allow people to walk over you. The same Jesus said, you're going to be wise as a serpent, but harmless as a dove.
Yeah.
Never said you had to be a fool.
No. Well, Paul said you had to be a fool for Christ, but I always said, he never said to be a damn fool. So, but what, for me, the value that critique gives is that it forces us to look at the expressions of Christianity that we follow, and to realize that sometimes Christianity can go too far, and that sometimes it needs to be controlled, reinterpreted, in a way that makes it reasonable and understandable to people, not to make people less than they ought to be, but to allow people, as one philosopher says, to allow human beings to be human beings, and not to be devalued in any way. Any other thoughts? Thank you, Anita. Any other thoughts from anybody? Anybody else want to come in and talk to me? Or is everybody sitting quietly? But the same two people have been talking to me now for the past 2 nights, third night. These are the only two people who like to talk to me. Anybody else willing to talk? Anybody else with any ideas? I'm here to learn from you as well. Part of my quest in teaching is to learn from the students with whom I interact. So talk to me, anybody. There is no wrong position on the question of God. We are all in this together, searching for an understanding of God. Anybody? Nobody? Nobody? Let me see who's in the chat and what they're saying. Oh, who's in the chat? Let's see who's saying. Okay. Need to put back on my specs now because I can't see. Many things that exist in this world that there is no scientific explanation. Many things exist in this world and there's no scientific explanation. Even in the medical field, there have been healings beyond scientific explanation. They're true. I think their experiences, or with persons who call themselves Christians, may have contributed to reveal something that exists today. That is true too. Thank you for your contributions in the chat. Okie dokie. That is a good segue into what I want to finish with. Because as we look at the world in which we find ourselves now, there are a lot of people out there who do not believe in God. And we need to ask ourselves, what has taken over as our God? I want to venture to suggest that what has taken over in our world as God are the products of human hands. In fact, our societies are not so much atheistic. Our modern society is not so much atheistic as it is idolatrous. The two philosophers we talked about earlier were saying that God had to be slain so that humanity could become more human in the face of a God who remains hidden. Idolatry remains a temptation because of this modern day quest for that which is tangible on which to pin one's hope. I also venture to suggest, and I might be wrong, I asked somebody today after I'd written this lecture and shared it with them, I asked them if I was too pessimistic, and they said yes. But I've been a priest for over 40 years. And a completely religious person is a very rare phenomenon. Even those who claim to be atheists in practice retain all sorts of camouflage myths. They retain all sorts of rituals. They have all kinds of superstitions. Let me also suggest that it is very difficult for human beings to live without worshiping something. It is very difficult for human beings to live without worshiping something. What do I mean? If they do not worship God, then they will worship nature. If they do not worship nature, then they worship technology. They do not worship technology, they will probably worship themselves or their own personal ideas. What I'm trying to say is that there is not a person out there who does not worship something. Nature, technology, themselves, their own personal ideas. Because atheism and idolatry are inseparable. A false concept of God leads to atheism, and atheism gives rise to new forms of idolatry. Persons reject God because God seems useless, or God seems to be an obstacle to human greatness. And then they turn around and give their lives to some petty gods. Now, science, which started out seeking to get beyond God, has ended up in some instances in taking God's place. And science is seen by some as the new deity, which explains everything. And because persons see the scientific explanation as being the in-all and it-all, they say, if science can explain it, then it renders the hypothesis of God obsolete and the hypothesis of a God superfluous. And if in a setting in which science becomes the go-to place for explanations, in such a situation, faith and hope and charity begins to disappear. Blind faith is now found in what the scientists and in what the technicians are saying. We live in a world in which persons are placing their hopes for a better and more humane society in the scientists and in the technicians. All their love is directed towards the realm of humanity or humanity-made inventions which ensure convenience and which give the greatest pleasure. And what has happened in our world is that there are some who have allowed science, which was never envisaged as a liberating force, to become a substitute for religion and something to replace God in people's lives. As religious people, as people of faith, we need to recognize that this present life is not some preparatory stage in the journey to the hereafter. We as religious people need to recognize that this life that we are living is not a preparatory stage in the journey into the hereafter. It is not some test to be taken to determine our positions beyond the grave. This life is not a test to be taken to determine our positions when or after we die. We need rather to see the world needs to be, we need to see the world as a place where our fulfillment can be realized. In other words, we need to live our lives and see this present life as an invitation, and also to see it as a challenge. We as human beings have been summoned to transform. We have been summoned to order the world. Yes, science can make it possible for us to come closer to an authentic knowledge of God. We ought never to give up the name God to anything that science encounters. God should never be the object of scientific investigation. God should never be the subject of scientific experimentation, because essentially God transcends all those fields. Science cannot be theistic or atheistic. Science must always remain neutral. And if we could scientifically demonstrate the existence of God, it would come down to objectifying and materializing God. Science cannot prove or disprove the existence of God. There are no empirical scientists who can prove the existence of God. There are no empirical scientists who can prove that there isn't a God. And the proofs of God's existence, which have been proposed by physicists, biologists, all of them tend to falsify the idea of God. Because you see, if God is to remain God, then God must remain outside the reaches of scientific experimentation. God is not a being open to experimental research. God is the reason behind all, the ultimate foundation of all things that exist. Karl Rahner, Rahner, in his theological investigations, Science as a Confession, he says, and I quote, God is not part of the world, but it's prerequisite. God is not an objective piece of knowledge alongside other objects, but the endlessness within which it runs its always finite course. God is not the final hypothesis resulting from a sketching of a rounded picture of the world. God is, on the contrary, the single thesis which is posited with every thesis which we use to build up our picture of the world. Therefore, the academic of today has the duty of accepting this realization, of not suppressing it into very hasty and cheap apologetics for an anthropomorphic belief in God, of understanding that it has truth, nothing to do with atheism in the proper sense. I like it. I'll read it again. It's found in Theological Investigations, Volume 3, pages 388 to 391. But I've taken this quotation out of it. God is not part of the world, but it's prerequisite. He says he, but I say God. God is not an objective piece of knowledge alongside other objects, but the endlessness within which it runs its always finite course. God is not the final hypothesis resulting from a sketching in of a rounded picture of the world. God is, on the contrary, the single thesis which is posited with every thesis which we use to build up our picture of the world. The academic of today has the duty of accepting this realization, of not suppressing it into a very hasty and cheap apologetics for an anthropomorphic belief in God, for an anthropomorphic belief in God, of understanding that it has truth and that it has nothing to do with atheism in the proper sense. End of quote. So, belief in modern society is that if God cannot be experienced by science, then God is unnecessary for scientific work, and therefore God does not exist. That is, what they're in effect saying is that a reality that cannot be experienced by science and its methodology is simply no reality at all. A being of no usefulness is also of no real interest. With that kind of thinking that is still out there in the world, and I know you know that it is still out there in the world, with that kind of thinking, a thinking which is enslaved to science and tangible experience, a lot of humanity has fallen prey to its own humanism. A humanism in which God is rejected as a vestige of an outmoded culture. A humanism in which God is rejected as obsolete and of no relevance for human well-being. An interest in God is reserved for specialists in mythology. Interest in God is seen as reserved for historians of past cultures. That is, belief being that in the primitive stages of human history, humanity needed that illusion. But now that humanity has come of age, humanity can cast God aside because God is no longer needed. Imelda. I trust some of you have seen Imelda's comment that just came up. Imelda's comment is interesting in that it squares with what Blaise Pascal, Blaise Pascal's wager that I told you about last week, which said that it is better to live a good life and discover that there's no God than to live a bad life and in the end discover that there is a God. Science tells one what to do now. So it tells one what one is to believe, and it explains all that is inapplicable. The belief by some, and there's some out there in our societies who still believe that God commissioned humanity to take charge of the world and to humanize the world. God made humanity rulers over nature. He implanted a controlling intelligence in humanity. And what has happened, and somebody said it earlier tonight, is that humanity has reversed these roles. Humanity has become, or humanity thinks of itself as the rulers of the world rather than the ruled of the world. Humanity thinks of itself as having replaced God. The idea being, God created humanity in God's image, and humanity has now returned the favor in creating God in humanity's image. Any thoughts? It is now 9:45 your time. Are there any closing thoughts that you have in the last 15 minutes that we can talk about? Anything anybody wants to say before?
Yeah, Doc,
Yes, please. Talk to me.
You had said about 5 minutes ago
Mhm.
that we're not preparing ourselves for a life after this one. Did I get that right?
Yes, that this life is not to be seen as preparatory for a
Preparation.
life to come. Yeah.
Right. What is your view on resurrection?
Let's deal with the resurrection of Jesus.
Right.
Now, the resurrected body of Jesus, the one that came back from the grave, was not the body that went into the grave. You realize that?
Well, I had this discussion once with a bishop,
Uh-huh.
not the one that was I don't want to get there, but a different bishop. Let me put it
A
that
different bishop. A different
Right.
bishop.
way. And I thought that resurrection was an awakening
Yeah.
of the apostles,
Yes.
what they were taught by Jesus.
Yes.
Why did they get thrown out the room for saying that?
Well, I always talk about the resurrection as the resurrection experience. I nearly got crucified for that as well. I preached that one Easter morning, and a
Okay,
bishop.
so you can be on my right hand.
Yes, a bishop politely wrote in the newspaper that he don't understand why this priest was talking about the resurrection experience. But for me, the resurrection was an experience. The disciples experienced Jesus alive after his death. They had that experience of him alive after his death. Okay. You call it an opening of the eyes of the disciples. I call it the disciples experiencing Jesus alive after his death.
Yeah,
And
same thing.
Same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was because of their faith in him that they had that experience of it.
Right.
All right. So if you didn't have faith in Jesus, then the resurrection would not be real for you, because it requires a faith position to move in the direction of accepting resurrection. Now, that resurrected body that we keep talking about behaves rather strangely. It used to walk into rooms with the doors closed and nobody used to see when it came in. So it seems it couldn't have been a physical body, because the physical body can't walk through any doors. And it used to appear and disappear at will. And I always tell people that the woman who went to the tomb, the woman who went to the tomb the morning, encountered Jesus and she did not recognize him.
Exactly.
She did not recognize him.
Exactly so.
So
that's my argument as well.
So there had to be something different about that resurrected body, because Mary did not recognize Jesus. She thought Jesus was somebody else.
Right, and these people knew Jesus intimately.
Exactly.
So the question then comes: if I know you so well, and then you resurrect, and I don't know who you are, who you're the gardener? You know, something doesn't square. Now, maybe it's a lack of faith on my part. I'm the first to admit that. But I have to reason these things out. So
yeah,
forgive me.
No, but there's no need to ask forgiveness, because I stand with you. I need to reason them out myself as well. So I am not one of those who jump on the resurrection bandwagon and behave as though there isn't a problem with it. There is a problem with it for me. And therefore I try to, yes, Valerie, we will be changed. We will be changed, but the question is, how will we be changed?
Precisely.
How will we be changed? That is the important question. But so, and I come back to the whether there's a God or not. And I think this for me is critical. Whether there is a God or not, the urge to live a good life should be a given. If we are living a good life because we hope that in living a good life here, we're going to get to heaven, then we are living a good life for the wrong reason. You should live a good life for living a good life's sake. Because if we're only doing good because we hope to get something out of it, we're already getting it. We're getting the satisfaction of knowing that there's something down the road. What I'm saying is, whether there is a God or whether there isn't a God, whether God exists or God does not exist, it should not affect the way in which you live your life. You should live a good life for living a good life's sake. But very often in our Christianity, people only try to live a good life because, as far as they're concerned, they're preparing for what is going to happen after death. That, for me, and I said this in a sermon sometime towards the end of last year, if you're only coming here to worship God because you think that coming here to worship God is going to get you into heaven, then don't come. You're coming for the wrong reason. But
in other words, God does not accept bribes.
No, he doesn't.
God doesn't have to accept bribes.
No, he does not.
Right.
So if people are worshiping God because they hope to get to heaven, then we got some problems in the church. Because people are not there because they want to be there. They're there because they want something else. And they're hoping that they will get it. And, you know, there will be a lot of disappointment waiting down the road for some of us, if that is our hope. And this place called heaven, with these with milk and honey and streets of gold and these mansions that you're going up to, I'm not so certain that that is real. That is a symbolic way of talking about a relationship with God.
And in some other religions, 7 virgins.
That too.
Right.
That too. So, you know, so we've come a long way, and we're halfway through this course. we have really examined what the early philosophers thought about God and the concept of God. We've looked at how the Old Testament writers understood God. And for them, God was a God who operated in their midst. And then when you read the Old Testament, you get that impression all the time. God was a God who acted. Whenever Israel found herself in times of difficulty, Israel interpreted it as God withdrawing himself from them, God moving away from them, God failing to act. Whenever they got out of the difficulty, it was God acting again. So God for the people of Israel, God for the Old Testament writers, was a God who acted in their particular historical context. What we did tonight was to look at an expression of Christianity as was practiced in the 19th century and analyzed by Feuerbach and Nietzsche. And we've seen some of the deficiencies that Christianity can fall into that can affect Christianity and make Christianity less than what Christianity ought to be. We've also looked at some modern day expressions of atheism, which is not an ideology. It is not something that says there is no God, but it is an attitude towards God where people are indifferent to God, where people don't pay any attention to God. As far as they're concerned, whether God exists or God does not exist, it doesn't matter, because they just live their lives the way they want to live their lives. Science has contributed to that kind of understanding. There are some who will tell you that they have no belief in God whatsoever. But I always contend that if you don't worship God, you worship something else. Humanity always has to have something to look up to feel good about. And sometimes we find it in technology. Sometimes we find it in our own selves. But it is there. It is there. And we need to realize that it is there. All right. I rest my case for tonight. And I trust that I have inspired you to think a little bit about your Christian faith and to examine it a bit more and to look at it and make sure it doesn't drift off into idolatry. Because faith has to be a way of life, not just an ideology. It has to be a way of life. I wish all of you a very pleasant weekend coming, and we look forward to joining with you again on Wednesday evening at the same time. Do have a good evening.
You too, Doc, and thank you very, very much.
Thank you, brother. God bless.
Most encouraging.
Thank you.
Take care.
All right. Take care, peoples.
Good.
Bye.